it's time to talk about some of my favorite books of the year. I had a really hard time coming up with honorable mentions. I was trying to just do 5 and it ended up as 15. So I apologize, it's gonna be a bit of a long one. These are in no particular order. I had a really hard time even ranking the top 10, which you'll see tomorrow, but these are the 15 that didn't quite make the list. Kicking things off with 7 Days in June. This is the story of our 2 main characters for 7 days while they are teenagers, having this whirlwind relationship, and also when they're coming back together as adults, when they have their own separate writing careers. They've kind of written each other into their books. It's so interesting the way that this is set up. Our female main character is a single mother. She has her daughter, and she also has a lot of chronic pain and migraines, and she's also the writer of a vampire erotica series. And it's so interesting to watch these 2 characters interact with each other. This book was so much more than a romance, and I don't say that because I think that a book can't just be a romance. I do think that a romance can just be a fun romance time and just about the romance. I was so worried about the way that this book was going to handle mental health and this relationship, especially when they were teenagers, that felt really codependent and really intense in a scary way. I had a relationship like that and it ended up being really unhealthy, and I was so worried with what this book was going to say about that, and I just absolutely loved the way that everything happened in this book. I mean, from the first page and the first line, it's so entertaining, but it also has this undercurrent of darkness, and it deals with that in a really thoughtful and intelligent and powerful way. It really felt like a book that I needed to read and also was really entertaining to read. Let me read you the first line. In the year of our Lord 2019, 32-year-old Eva Mercy nearly choked to death on a piece of gum. Okay, sticking with the dark themes and mental health conversation, the next book I want to talk to you about is A Little Life. I did not talk about this book at all on my channel because I wanted to give myself the space to DNF this if I wanted to. That did not happen. And in some ways, I kind of wish that I hadn't read this book. It did a lot of things to my mental health in ways that I was not expecting. If you have a history with self-harm, I would not read this book. It's a lot. I'm sure you've heard of this book before. We're following a group of friends basically throughout their whole lives. They meet in college. We're learning about one of them in particular, Jude. He has a really traumatic past that he is working through and having a really hard time with. This book depicts trauma in such a realistic way. I felt so seen and heard reading this, and it was also really, really difficult for my mental health to read this book. It brought up a lot of things that I was like, oh, okay, I need to go back to therapy and talk about this because I haven't worked through that as much as I thought I had. So An Approach with Caution book didn't make my top 10 just because I don't feel comfortable recommending this to anyone. The way that this author talks about this book, I also don't love. Ultimately, I am really glad that I read this book, which is why it's in my 15 honorable mentions. Okay, I want to stand up. Let's stand up. Whew, good, I've been sitting for too long. This is John Green's nonfiction. He originally had this idea to turn this into a podcast, and I read this as an audiobook, and I think something about this as an audiobook really works. And I went and bought myself a physical copy because I loved it so much and I wanted to talk about it in a different video that I made, and I'll link that up there if you want to watch that, about why I hate reading books. This is a series of essays, and I love reading essays and short story collections on audiobook because you can kind of have a walk or a task that you do for one essay, and then you can turn it off and go and move on to the next thing that you need to do with your day. And I just really enjoyed that little piece of wisdom, that little piece of entertainment, that little piece of John Green's head that I was in for that moment of my day. So the concept of this book is John Green rating different things that humans have made. So the Anthropocene is the period of time in which humans have impacted the world. He's rating things like ancient cave art and sunsets and Dr. Pepper, and it's just so human, if that makes sense. he's talking about these things in a really profound way, but also a really humble way. It's self-reflective. It's talking about the pandemic. It is just a really interesting snapshot in time when John Green wrote this. And it is so historical that it's so interesting to read something that is looking back at periods of history, also written at the beginning of the pandemic before we know what we know now. It was just really interesting to be in his head at that period of time when we really did not know what this was all going to entail. I think nonfiction is where John Green thrives. I hope he does more of this. I would love to read more nonfiction, especially I'll watch John Green rate anything. I would love that to happen. Next is The Fifth Season. I knew this was going to be one of my favorite books of the year before I picked it up, and surprise, I was right. This is a climate-focused story. Basically, what's happened is the earth is falling apart. There are earthquakes, and there are these things called fifth seasons. So we have the regular 4 seasons. A fifth season is a period of winter, like an ice age type situation that's lasting many, 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 many years. N.K. Jemisin writes in a way that is so compelling and interesting, and I just flew through this book. I always wanted to pick this up. I love to read physically at the end of every day. And sometimes I'm like, oh, I really just want to go to sleep, but you know, maybe I'll skip reading tonight, or maybe I'll just read a few pages. I always got hooked in by this book, and I always wanted to pick it up. The way that this book plays with time and point of view is so interesting. A large portion of this is written in second person, so the book is talking directly to you. You are a character in the book. And I loved the way that that whole concept was done in here so much. I've never read a book like that before in my life, and it was so compelling. And now being halfway through the second book in this series, where that point of view situation isn't done in the same way that it's done in here, it kind of feels like this is something that would only work in one book. And what I'm trying to say here is that I really liked the transition out of that conversation while still keeping the reason why it was done intact, if that makes sense. It probably won't unless you've read the book. It had political intrigue, it had moments of joy and happiness, it had relationships. It was just so compelling all the way through. I did get really overwhelmed in the first chapter, just learning all these terms. This is my first foray back into high fantasy, which I haven't really read very much, you know, since I was young. And coming back into this in an adult fantasy, it was a little overwhelming, and the appendix honestly freaked me out. And I'm so glad that I pushed through that first chapter and that my excitement about the book was enough to keep me going, because it's just such a good book. I really, really recommend this one. Then we have The House in the Cerulean Sea, which I needed at the point in my life when I read this. I went to the bookstore and grabbed this right after the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision came out, and I was just feeling awful. And I went to the bookstore looking for this book because I knew that it was going to be a warm gay hug, and it was exactly what I wanted. I was shocked by how much I loved the conversations about parenting in this book. I'm someone who doesn't think that I'm going to have children. I have my animals, and that's really all I think that I want to do as a person. I don't think that I want to have my own children, but I loved watching the characters in this book parent these children. I got ahead of myself. The premise of this book is that we have Linus, who is, Linus I think is his name. Our main character is a social worker, and he's going to different orphanages to make sure that the children are safe and that the world is safe from the children, because they are magical children. And he ends up going to this orphanage that is like all of the worst children, the most dangerous children. The Antichrist is there. At his day job in the city, it's like very bureaucratic. His time is very segmented, and it's constantly raining. And then he gets on the train and he's going to this house on the Cerulean Sea to visit this orphanage and meet these children, and the rain stops. It's just a really beautiful story about somebody who isn't happy where they are, finding a space that is for them. And I really needed that when I read this book. It really spoke to me. I loved the magical element of this as well. I think when I am feeling stuck or feeling like I want to escape where I am in life or the world that I live in, going to a fantasy world that is really cozy is one of my favorite things to do because it is completely separate from our world. And so I don't feel like, oh, I wish I were there, because it's completely different to how my world is, but I can still escape to that world and live in that world and have that really comforting message for a while. So if you're looking for some comfort, I think The House in the Cerulean Sea is a great choice. Then I have something that might be a little bit out of pocket, and that's the book How to Not Die Alone. This is written by the, I think, relationship manager at Hinge, and she has a lot of expertise and degrees under her belt about cognitive science, and there are a lot of studies quoted in here. If you liked the relationship conversations in The Defining Decade, I think you would really enjoy this book. I listened to this on audiobook and then bought a physical copy and immediately lent it out to a friend. I just think this is the perfect book for anyone who is looking to be in a relationship or is in a relationship. It talks about the whole journey from like going on dates and dating and getting into a relationship to moving in together, getting engaged, getting married, having children. It goes through the whole thing. And I think it is just such a good book to really reflect and think about how you approach relationships and what really makes a relationship work. I think it's really easy to get caught up on, oh, do we both like sports, or do we both like books, or do we both like going to the movies, when those aren't really the things that make relationships stick. It's your communication styles and the way that you approach conflict. And that's something that was really good for me to hear from an expert who's quoting sources and studies and everything. If you're a logic-minded, data-oriented person like I am, and you also like hearing these case studies of real people who are putting this knowledge into action, I think this would be a really good choice. Next, we have The Traveling Cat Chronicles. I'm not ashamed to say that I sobbed reading the end of this book. I had been warned that the ending of this book was going to make me cry. I still ended up accidentally finishing it while I was on a walk and just sobbing. Just absolutely sobbing, head down, walking quickly past my neighbors' houses, trying to get home so I could cry in peace. This to me represents exactly why I love so much of the Japanese literature that I read. It's really a very simple story when you break it apart, but it contains so much thought and complexity when you really get into it. This is the story of a man who has to give up his cat, and he is basically traveling far and wide to visit all of his friends and acquaintances from his past to see if he can find someone to take the cat in. And the story is told from the cat's perspective. So it's just this really interesting look of the cat thinking he knows what's going on, the cat learning about his owner through meeting all of his friends, and also us learning about this person who owns this cat and wondering why he's giving the cat away and learning why the cat doesn't quite fit at any of these friends' houses. And it's just a beautiful story. Give me a talking cat talking about emotional things and I'll cry anytime. I think this might be something that I continue to reread, so if you're looking for a good cathartic cry, this is the one to pick up. Next, we have an amazing nonfiction, Biased. If you like audiobooks, this one, perfect as an audiobook. It's narrated by the author herself. This book is talking about implicit bias, and the way that she breaks this down is so compelling. I was aware of the concept, thought I was knowledgeable about it, read this book. I knew nothing before I read this book. The author talks about her work teaching this to organizations like police departments and talking about the hurdles that she has to overcome, and the ways that she goes about teaching this work is just so interesting. And the knowledge that she's bringing itself is absolutely incredible. This should be required reading in schools. There's a nonfiction in my top 10, but if you read one nonfiction next year, let it be this one. I think it's that powerful. I want to sit down again. Let's go somewhere else. Sorry. Much better. This is Lonely Castle in the Mirror. This is the story of a group of school children. All of these children, for whatever reason, are not fitting in, and so they're all kind of outcasts who have been brought together in this magical castle in the Mirror. So the premise of this is that all these children have mirrors that start glowing. They walk through the mirrors to find this castle. In the castle is the Wolf Queen, who's on the cover here. They have a year to find this hidden room. The first one who gets there will be granted a wish. Once that wish is granted, the castle disappears. It's a really interesting concept that sounds like it's going to be high action with everyone trying to find the hidden room and figure out what everyone's deal is. It ends up being a much different book than it appears to be. It's much slower pace. It's really majority a character study where we're learning about all of these children, and then at the end, the stakes get so much higher and we do kind of get this fast-paced thing going on, and there are a series of reveals that I just really was not expecting with the way that the first chunk of this book went. And I'm just really, really happy with every direction that this took. Based on the synopsis, I thought one thing, and then I completely changed what I thought, and then it changed again. There were so many evolutions to this story within the book, and I just ate up all of them. I loved every page of this. Again, it's a really cozy story that has a lot going on under the surface. Hi friends, it's the next day. I ended up impromptu spending some time with family last night, which is always lovely during the holiday season. So I'm back to tell you the rest of my honorable mentions today. So let's talk about Catherine House. This is another book that I really needed when I read it, and I wasn't expecting to love this so much. It has really low ratings, and I do tend to enjoy books that are lower rated because I like to kind of sink my teeth into something ambiguous or something that is a little weird that might not connect with everyone when they pick a book up. I tend to enjoy those types of stories. And this one was a perfect example of that, and I think this was the exact moment when I needed to read this because our author wrote this book very nostalgically looking back on her time in college. She went to a very prestigious college. I believe she went to Yale. Yes, she graduated from Yale, and so she's kind of reflecting on that time while she's writing this. In a similar age to where I am now, being a couple of years out of school. Crazy that someone my age could write a book this good, but anyways, we're allowed to be at different points in our life. I just was in the exact same headspace I think that she was in, and feeling like I missed that time when you could just study for hours on end and talk to friends who were studying different things and find the connection points between what you were studying and just have these really interesting conversations that are much more difficult to have now when everyone is kind of siloed at work and you're not learning together. I think it's a really interesting thing that happens when you are studying with people in school who are studying different things, but you're all studying in the same place. There's a lot of really amazing interdisciplinary conversations that come out of those conversations that I don't really have anymore because I talk to the people at work that I need to talk to get my work done. I don't really discuss my work with my friends. And this kind of brought back those, wine-filled nights where you're just really excited about what you're learning about, and you're coming up with different names for things because your study might have one name for something, and maybe your friend who's in a completely different major, their discipline has a different name for that thing. It's just such a cool feeling, and I found that in here. Let me tell you what it's actually about. So this is a dark academia book. If you like dark academia, I think you'll really like this. I think the one that I'll compare this most to is Vita Nostra, which is another book that I really enjoyed, but this one just stood above the pack in this list because it was perfect for me in 2022. So it felt like it deserved a place in this top 15 of 2022, and you'll see some other dark academia books popping up in my top 10 as well. This one is set at Catherine House, that is the college. It's a very prestigious, Ivy level league college, but if you get into Catherine House, it's free. You're there for 3 years, and everything that you need to study at Catherine House and to live at Catherine House is provided to you. The people who graduate from this university go on to lead these really illustrious careers. They are really successful once they leave Catherine Catherine House. Our main character gets to Catherine House and starts to notice there's some things going on. There's a weird major that's really selective and super secretive and a little bit culty, and there are some other weird culty things going on as well that are so intriguing. I loved the ending of this. It's really ambiguous, and I think that probably plays into why this has such a low rating, but I love ambiguous endings. I loved how far this book went with the weird vibe that was going on. I think it ended up in a really interesting place, but it was this layer of nostalgia for that college time that really made this one of my favorite things that I read this year. So that's Catherine House. I have the Goodreads Choice Award for Fantasy to thank for this book. I read a majority of the books that were nominated for Goodreads Choice in a series of videos, which I'll link in the description if you're interested. But this was one that I wasn't planning on picking up on my own, and I grabbed it just for that video. And I'm so happy that I did. This book really took me by surprise. Again, I think this is a case where this ended up just being the perfect book for me. Just an amalgamation of things that are so up my alley in a way that I wasn't expecting. Like, there's even a little New Orleans street cat who looks exactly like my little New Orleans street cat. We spend a lot of time in New Orleans here, and I am missing the city of New Orleans right now. I've been not living there for 2 years now, and I definitely miss the city. So it was really nice to be back there in this book, running through the same streets that I remember. Again, I'm too excited about these books to tell you what they're actually about. This is the story of Thistlefoot, which is a house on chicken legs that our two siblings, the Yaga siblings, inherit from a distant relative. It arrives on the shores of America. They open up the storage box and discover they have inherited a house on chicken legs. They end up going across the country doing this puppet show. This book talks so much about generational trauma. It's a Baba Yaga retelling. It's much darker than I thought it was going to be. This is in the fantasy category, but I would say this could be classed as horror as well. They're being chased by a big bad, and just the way that this book talks about memory and events as ghosts is so interesting. I gushed about this book in one of those Goodreads Choice Awards videos, so I'll link that up there if you want to check out all of my rambling about how much I loved this book. And next up we have another book of the month pick, so let me grab that. This is Sign Here. This is the story of our main character, Peyote Trip. He is in hell in the deals department, and his job is to convince people to make a deal with the devil and sign their souls over. This is a very funny story as we learn all of the bureaucratics of hell and all of the different things that are going on with how hell is set up, like the fact that the puddle depth is randomly generated, so you might step in a puddle and it goes up to your waist. It's just really funny. The only alcohol in hell is Jägermeister. Little tidbits of world building that are just really hilarious. This book also is following a family on Earth that our main character has a vested interest in, and we're following all the members of the family as he tries to get them to sell their souls. What happens with our family is this really over-the-top thriller that I just really enjoyed. So we have kind of these two storylines that are going on. It was over the top, it was funny, it also had a lot of heart, had some really emotional conversations going on. If you want to hear more in-depth thoughts, again, I read this one in a vlog, so I'll link that up there. I just really, really loved this one. Next up, we have Heartstopper. It's taken me a long time to read this graphic novel series. I just love this. I knew this was going to be a cozy good time, but I wasn't prepared for the level of craft that was in this graphic novel. I think Alice Oseman has just a lot of talent, and the way that this is structured is just so smart. All of the speech bubbles are handwritten. It just creates this really compelling and interesting story. This is a love story. We have two boys who meet in school and fall in love, and it's really freaking cute. I read this so fast, and I'm trying to pace myself through the whole series, so I have picked up the second book and I'm saving it for my next 24-hour readathon. I love reading Heartstopper when I do 24-hour readathons because I know it's just going to be a breath of joy and coziness and love, and that's usually what I'm looking for. When I do 24-hour readathons, I want a cozy time, and so I'm kind of saving up these little pockets of joy so I know kind of what I'm getting myself into, and I like to keep them in reserve for when I need a burst of happiness. So that is what I use Heartstopper for, and I encourage you to do the same. We only have 2 books left, so I'm going to take you back over to the bookcases to do our final 2. The Hacienda is one of my favorite haunted house stories of all time. I highly recommend the audiobook for this one. It is fantastic. This is just exactly what I'm looking for in a gothic tale. I love The Haunting of Hill House. It's one of my favorite books of all time, and I've kind of been chasing that haunted house story ever since, looking for something that is as good as that. This is the one that I have found. We are following our main character in this marriage of convenience. She needs this marriage in order to give her and her family financial stability. So she marries this man without really knowing much about him. She goes to his hacienda. The house is massive and sprawling and haunted, and it is such a good haunting story. I love when something is haunted way back in the past and we learn some history, but I also love when something is very recently haunted and our characters are still involved with and grappling with the events that led up to the haunting of that house, and that was the case in this book. It also has a lot of other things going on. There is a witchy element to this. There is a priest who is attractive and maybe a little romance going on. It is just such a fun time and also a really scary time. I haven't had a ton of success with gothic literature recently, and this one was just what I needed to rekindle my love for the genre. Highly recommend. I loved this so much that I do want to buy myself a physical copy. Unfortunately, this is not mine. It is being gifted to one of my family members for Christmas, so makes a great gift as well. And last but not least is The Sentence. This author is a Minnesotan. It's set in Minneapolis, which is where I grew up, and being back in my home state, while a lot of really awful things are going on, this covers George Floyd's murder, this covers the pandemic. This also covers a haunted bookstore. It deals a lot with Native American culture, and I absolutely loved every single page of this. I know this didn't work for a lot of people. It was nominated and shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. I typically read 1 or 2 books from the Women's Prize for Fiction every year. This was the only one I got around to this year, but it was a home run. It was just exactly what I wanted it to be. And I really only knew that it was about a haunted bookstore, picked it up immediately. And what I got was so much more. There's a lot of conversations in here about racial injustice. There's a lot of conversations in here about what it is to be haunted by something. It just really worked for me, and I'm hoping to pick up more by this author very, very soon. Okay, well, there you have it, folks. Those are my top 15 honorable mentions for 2022. I'm going to be posting tomorrow my favorite books of the year, the top 10, and I'm going to be ranking them. So I do have a best book of the year this year. I wasn't sure I was going to be able to do it, but in the end, it was kind of a gut decision, no-brainer, what my favorite book of the year is. So if you're interested, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that tomorrow. I hope you're having a lovely holiday season, and I guess I will see you tomorrow. Bye.